So this morning we dealt with this, but my take, we can move up to the modern period with Xi Jinping. And it's really, there's elite nationalism and mass nationalism in China. And we heard of the patriotic national education program that indoctrinates everybody into a Chinese view of the whole South China Sea as theirs. But elite nationalism fits into Xi Jinping's dream of the great revitalization or national rejuvenation to overcome that century of national humiliation. The mass nationalism has taken an anti-Japanese turn over the Sengakus. And I now think that China has moved into a period of chauvinism. The entire discussion of China's historic rights doesn't have the peoples of Southeast Asia who live there even mentioned. It's just Chinese. And it's like 2,000 years ago, there was no one else living in the region that we know from anthropological work. That's not true. And it's leading to aggressive patriotism, where not one Chinese captain, to my knowledge, has ever been punished for crashing into a Vietnamese boat, murdering a Vietnamese skipper, beating up the crew. They can all operate with impunity, protecting this 9-dash line. And then we have the hacktivism, the taking down of Vietnamese websites and defacing them, and language that is scatological. So now, I'm focusing on China, and we could find nationalism, we heard in Vietnam, in reverse, but so I just want to mention that. So we have the Chinese position. The Chinese activities in the South China Sea date back over 2,000 years ago. Who else was there? Huh? China was the first country to discover, name, explore, and exploit the resources of the South China Sea islands, and the first to continuously exercise sovereign powers over them. China is like the 19th century or earlier white man that came to Australia and looked at this big island and said, it's terra nullius, we occupy it, and the Aborigines don't have any say. Well, now our high courts have ruled the indigenous people do in Australia, and if I were in Australia speaking now, I would not have begun my presentation without acknowledging the original inheritors of that land. And so in this 21st century, to totally ignore the peoples of Southeast Asia, who maybe not had a Han dynasty, but they certainly were there and traversing it, needs to be taken into account. So we have domestic actors fueling in and backing. It's all me too. The fishing industry, provincial level. We get subsidies. We can go on. The oil industry and its various companies. And it's always overcapacity, oversupply, but China can afford to pick up the tab. Provincial governments on the little areas. Maritime law enforcement agencies, once the Five Dragons, now the Coast Guard and others have taken it. And of course, the People's Liberation Army Navy. So we go to fisheries here. There are over 100,000 vessels in the north of that operate in the South China Sea, 100 and some odd major fishing trawlers instead. These ships are encouraged to have steel hulls, and depending on the sizes of their engines, they're given more subsidies and encouraged, because China has overfished and polluted its zones, to move further and further south. And so the massive problem in the South China Sea is that we're facing really a potential crisis in the next decades, if not now, over that. It's exacerbated by the sheer rapacious nature. Blowing up reefs to get giant clams, to get aphrodisiacs for the men, massive sea protesting ships. And so the artificial islands that I'm building up will serve as forward operating bases for these interests. And with that, the military, from China's point of view, must then protect them. If we could turn to hydrocarbon reserve, no one has ever done a good survey, but the US Energy Information Agency comes up with 800 billion. China's estimates are 3 to 28 times larger than America. So they must, if they believe that there's all this oil. But industry specialists say it's peak oil. You're a thirsty man, you give him a can of Coke or a bottle of water, he drinks it, and it's gone. So very quickly, China's, even if the economy slows down and had all the oil and could get it, within decades it would be gone. So what's the year? You still have to import it from elsewhere. Of the hydrocarbon reserves, the 67% are really gas, and it's in the southern reaches of the South China Sea. So the fisheries are pushing south, and that's where the oil and gas is. And then for the exploration, you have these massive, this is one of two more on stream that we heard referred to earlier, the Haiyan Shuyo or the HD 981, but they were called China's National Mobile Territory. Who goes exploring for oil with 80 to 100 ships that surround them? And who can have fishermen who are supposed to be earning a living out there crashing into Vietnamese boats? They do it because they're subsidized. They're an arm and they're a militia of the Chinese state. So let's just Moving to geostrategic imperatives, which I think are more important. From a Chinese perspective, America has a Cold War mentality, and to me, they've got a continental mentality. Tough luck. If you're a continent, you've got neighbors, and you've got islands off it, that's geography. You are surrounded. But it didn't happen with the Cold War. It happened by birth of geography. So they say US rebalancing is containment, and Daniel kept mentioning A2AD, and for the uninitiated, that's the Pentagon translation of Chinese counterintervention strategy, anti-access area denial, just to mention that. But Chinese call it counterintervention. As Chinese economy has grown, they have a mercantilist thing about trying to build all the Chinese ships to take the oil, to do all the trade. They have to protect their sea lines of communication, which stretch across. And power projection to go with it, and I'll be focusing on Hainan and Woody Islands and the artificial islands. So from the rebalancing as containment is that network of American bases left over from the Second World War, Japan, Korea, now in Guam, returned to the Philippines on rotational basis. Wow, 500 Marines, 2,000 Marines maximum in Darwin. No one ever knows that the US, China, and the US conduct military exercises. They're very small scale, they're survival exercises, but China is part of it in that. And then you have, and then the basing of the Poseidons in Singapore and Malaysia, et cetera, that China sees this as a containment of itself. And then we had Daniel point out that for China to project power, that in 95, 96, when Taiwan was almost using the I independence word, China lobbed missiles in the Straits to try to intimidate China. America sent 2 carrier task groups. In a sense, China resolved never again. Let's push the American military out. The major contingency for China is Taiwan, but the larger strategic picture comes into it as well. And we have to take that both. So it's to push America out beyond that first island chain, further into the Western Pacific, by combining land-based aircraft, missiles, as well as naval ships and everything else that I picture here. So that is to secure. The southern flank is vulnerable. The US is in Guam, it can come around, it can sail up through there, and Hainan Island is a major base, so they need a screening zone to protect that deployment. And I mentioned sea lines of communication. You hear the Chinese Malacca dilemma. The Malacca dilemma is like a choke point that at times of conflict, the Americans could close it off and China would be isolated. That's partly true, except I had an Australian admiral tell me it's not a choke point because there are alternate ways. A choke point is one that you turn it off and you can't travel. That's Straits of Hormuz, so you don't have to bring it there. And the southern Chinese provinces hype the Malacca dilemma so they can get funds to build land routes through on larger initiatives itself. But nonetheless, China does have legitimate interest in protecting it, and no one else protects your own sea lanes except yourself. Okay. Chinese, we'll hear more from me in a moment about the maritime law enforcement agencies and the civil, but increasingly more and more combat-oriented practical exercises, particularly this year, landing on islands. They've done it before. And from an Australian perspective, the perfectly normal and acceptable under international law, but sailing down, appearing off the coast of northern Australia, passing through the Straits of Sunda and the Lombok, we're an alarm bell, and that's why we're commissioning 12 French submarines for the future that we feel our interests have got to be. The problem is that China, it's developing a large military, and it's not exactly good on transparency and telling us what it's doing and its behavior. So from about 2007, 2008, it built a major naval base on Hainan Island with James Bond types, that's the press telling us, of underground tunnels, where they have conventional, and the Jin class, I thought it was 5, SSBNs, they are ballistic missile nuclear carrying submarines, for those not used to the terminology, SSBNs, and they're based there. And the most modernization of the 3 fleets that China has is taking place in the southern one. And Hainan Island must now be protected from all its approaches because it's a major base, so that adds on to it. We had plenty of discussion on Woody Island, where it's been militarized for years. I'm highly critical of the American Freedom of Navigation patrols there. It was testing law, but it was a distraction from in my point of view, from the Spratlys, much more important. And we saw that when the second Freedom of Navigation patrol was launched, China put in very high-level anti-aircraft missile system, the radar to go with it, and up to 10 jet and other aircraft itself. They administer it from times past by raising the level of Sanxia to a prefecture and give it. This is their administration over the Macclesfield Bank and everything, just declaring it's Chinese. How you do that? This chart here, it's difficult. It comes from the Office of Naval Intelligence. Shows the number of Coast Guard vessels. China at 205 is greater than all the other countries in the region in number. The difference in sizes are those above 1,000 tons and below 1,000 tons. And that's misleading because in China you start at 3,000 tons these days and move up to 5,000 tons. And since I'm in America, I can say it. It's difficult to use the words in Australia. It's like an American high school football team playing against the pros. You eventually are going to be pushed down the field by the sheer mass and size of those numbers, as we saw over the HD 981. And these are the cutting edge, but they're armed ships. And they have electromagnetic warfare capabilities that have isolated Indonesian ships that have apprehended fishermen and forced them to give up. And so, and because they're white-hulled, and as Daniel was pointing out, it creates an asymmetric challenge. And if poor Philippines sent a former Coast Guard ship but commissioned it its Navy to arrest fishermen, China made a meal of the biggest ship in the Philippines Navy. Well, wow. That, anyway. So when we go down to the 7 islands, 7 artificial islands in the South China Sea, I am adamant, and I started using the words and I've corrected myself in writing, nothing that China is doing is land reclamation. There is no island above water at high tide that had soil eroded by wind or sea. There are low tide elevations or rocks. And the fact that you build an artificial island doesn't change their original status. And the triangle I've done here, and years ago when General Schaefer was telling everybody about larger triangles, no one wanted to listen. Each one of them has a 3,000-meter airstrip. As one American admiral said, 747 would take off and there'd be an extra 915 meters left. B-52 could do it just fine, but it'd be too short for a space shuttle. And you can then, so almost any plane in the Chinese military inventory could be based there for periods of time, but they would need fuel storage and revetments. So, but the fact that, they say it's for search and rescue. Other countries have airfields. And when you do search and rescue under ICAO, the International Convention, you're supposed to cooperate with regional states. Since China is big on infrastructure projects, they could have built up the one for Malaysia and the Philippines, which is ramshackle, and Vietnam's less than 600-meter thing, and they could do search and rescue that way. China claims it's only catching up, and this was released in the U.S. Asia-Pacific Strategy Report, and it's a timeline showing what they've done. I did a report that will come out at the Shangri-La Dialogue, and they removed a lot because they said it's not military. What Vietnam and other countries would do, not China. And I said, but that was precisely the point, because China says we're catching up and only doing what other people do. Yeah, you end up creating a massive area out of nothing that dwarfs the area of countries, and where Vietnam used to bring barges and dump soil. Recently they've been caught out with some dredging a particular area. But the militarization and putting that infrastructure in is of an order of magnitude that's different. So here, shows what everybody's doing. I end on these kind of snapshots. This is Fiery Cross Reef showing what's now a completed runway. This is the forward operating headquarters. This is the place that communicates to planes flying over. It doesn't jam the Poseidon, but it jams Philippine military aircraft as they fly over. It's a virtual air defense zone. China says, get out of our military alert area, or you're threatening Chinese ships. They have no capacity yet to enforce it, but what's this military alert zone? An artificial island does not have any airspace. It's an artificial island. 500 meters around it, safety zone, but none of the other entitlements itself. Subi, this is the triangle we're talking about. Now, Fiery Cross is opposite Vietnam. And if you put anti-submarine warfare planes in there, the stealth factor of Vietnam's enhanced kilos would be undermined. And in all this, I forgot to make an earlier point on the island chain. is that the U.S. has a system called a SOSUS system, a sound underwater system, so that first island chain through to Taiwan can detect the transit of submarines. So if China needs a reliable deterrent nuclear force, so America, if it attacked China first, they could take out Los Angeles in retaliation. If their submarines are known, then their ability to have a secure second strike deterrent is undermined. So in the South China Sea, there's talk, there are very deep water channels that the submarines of all navies traverse. But with these places here, China could put its own SOSUS in and begin to mark the transit of the U.S. It's the great game at the nuclear level, and that's why I say geopolitics is now prime. China's stronger, the U.S. rebalances challenged it, and this is Subi, where another 3,000-meter strip has been put in. A mischief reef again. This is the comparison of airstrips. The problem is there's only one for China, and there should be three. So there's, that is the size. And in the Philippines, one of my former students, this is their Western Command commander, took journalists there, and the plane almost went off the dirt runway because it's so bad. When China is only catching up, whatever. Now, let me just end with 2 points, 2 slides. What's the purpose? China says it's building these islands to improve the living conditions of Chinese that are there, providing meteorological data. You remember in 1988, 87, that was the pretext for seizing Fiery Cross Reef from the Vietnamese and killing 60-odd Vietnamese engineers. Scientific research, search and rescue, shelter for fishing boats, a base for oil exploration, support for the Coast Guard. And of course, as I say, when all these assets are there, you've got to defend them. And then China says it's based on the level of threat. So whatever the U.S. does in the Philippines is a wonderful pretext. America does this, we must step up our military defense capacity. I'm at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and I don't speak for the Defence Department, but the University of New South Wales employs us, so we have freedom in Australia, academic freedom, dealing with our military. But the people I talk to, and American admirals in public, say these will be forward operating bases, or post, really. And they have not yet put in fuel storage, which would tell us exactly, what capacities they would have. But they have constructed piers for naval combatants. They've landed military aircraft, but not kept them there. Senior Chinese commander recently visited. Long-range radar, so China would be able to pick up and know quite well what's going on there and respond. And the response would be to get out of our area or to shoulder you away from that. Advanced anti-aircraft missile systems, in an air defense identification zone. So I was prompted to add a new slide to this. As a result, I wanted to ask Enrico this morning, he used the word to demilitarize. There is that massive debate between the US and China on militarization, who's doing it. And it calls for a definition. What I've tried to do is say, it is a spectrum of activities. And in the ordinary dictionary sense, militarization means to give a military character to a place. I'm at the University of New South Wales on the Defense Academy. All my students are cadets and midshipmen. It's militarized. They're wearing uniforms. And occasional security guards carry sidearms when the security threats go up. Okay, so you do that. To all the way over, militarization is putting in place, the fortifications were listed in the Enrico's case. The fortifications and naval vessels, I think, were the only 2 items. Making preparations for war, putting in that revetted hangars, fuel storage, and the kind of offensive amphibious forces, etc. So one of the problems of defining militarization is that a 3,000-meter-long airstrip can support search and rescue. It can have Airbuses of tourists flying down from China. It could do medical evacuation. You could host a conference of Yale scholars and fly them out there, or, scholars friendly to China. So that's dual use, and they could rapidly change. But when you move over to the red line, it's offensive capability, and that's militarization. And it would be for the leaders in the region to define what that is. So I'm 14 seconds shy of the 20 minutes, so I thank you.